I tell them not today. No, 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 not today. Maybe tomorrow, not today. No, 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 not today. Maybe tomorrow, not today.
Hi, and welcome to a new episode of the Let's Talk Melbourne podcast, where we're having a conversation about redundant charities with the author, Wei. And we are at our new venue partner, Jeho Restaurant in Richmond on Swan Street in Melbourne. So if you're around, please do come and check it out. And before we kick off the podcast, I will request my guest to introduce himself, if that's okay.
Of course, it's okay. Thank you, Vikas. I really appreciate being here with you at this lovely venue. So my name is Weh Yeoh. So I'm the author of this book, Redundant Charities, that I wrote last year in 2023. And I'm also a 5-time founder of different social enterprises and charities, different parts of the world. I've lived in Cambodia, China, Vietnam, India, and of course Australia. And really interested in the topic of how we can help people best.
Absolutely. Firstly, congratulations on your book. It's fantastic. I want to start off by asking, so to help our listeners and viewers understand. I read somewhere there are two reasons people read books. One is for pleasure and one is for information. How would you describe Redundant Charities as?
That's funny because I thought you were going to say first reasons for pleasure and second reasons for pain.
Well, maybe that's one way of looking at it.
Well, hopefully it's not for pain.
It's not for pain, yeah.
I think it's a bit of both. I think, if you're vaguely interested in the notion of how to help people best, if you're a little bit skeptical about charities, but also you want to have an alternative model that makes sense, then I think this is going to be a good read for you. And I think that's where the pleasure part comes in.
Yeah.
Of course, there's information in there that's, I think accurate.
Yeah.
But, when it comes to helping people and charities, I do feel in general there's quite a lot of bad vibes really about it. Even internally in the sector, there's a lot of complaints about how restrictive helping people is these days. So I do think it's important then to come up with alternative ways of doing it and solutions and to provide hope. And I think that's what this book can do.
So take us back. What was the germ that sort of manifested into this book? Like, when did you first get the idea that, I think it's time for me to write a book, and not just write a book, but write a book about this particular topic?
Well, my background's physiotherapy initially, so I've always been interested in helping people and getting people to recover and to live full lives.
Yeah.
But I wasn't a very good physio, so I only lasted about 2 years. And I'm a bigger picture thinker.
Yeah.
And I did work overseas in China with a big charity, and my main issue that I had with that work was a lot of the energy that went into the project was more about keeping the charity going.
Yep.
It seemed to be more invested in continuing this cycle of the cycle of dependence, that charities often find themselves in.
Yeah.
And so then later on I ended up in Cambodia and I started another charity which is looking into developing the profession of speech therapy.
Yes.
And it was then that I thought, we need to have a charity that has a distinct endpoint. We need to be able to say, this charity should close, because when it ends, we know we've actually achieved the job, right? Rather than keeping it going forever and ever.
Yeah.
And so that was 10, 11 years ago now.
Okay.
And so the germ or that idea was always there. And then after handing off the charity to local Cambodian people, I moved back to Australia. And one of the things I did was in 2019, I did a Tedx talk called Why International Charities Should Make Themselves Redundant.
Yep.
Controversial title, controversial talk to a certain extent, particularly internally in the sector. And then it was kind of from there that I thought, okay, well, I need to do this book. And then thankfully, or unfortunately, or fortunately, lockdown was when it all happened.
Yep.
So COVID lockdown, I thought, okay, if ever there's a time to sit down and write it, it'll be now. So that was 2021.
Awesome. Now, why redundant? Why the word redundant, if you can talk to that?
Well, redundant and redundancy, they're typically words that are associated with failure. If I said, come into your office, I want to talk to you about redundancy, that's not necessarily a good start.
Good positive spin,
Exactly. If your manager said that, you'd be trembling.
Yes.
But I think when it comes to charities, redundancy indicates success, because it means that you've actually achieved something and handed it off to maybe your local partners or the local government for them to do for themselves. But that's not what most charities, I believe, think at the moment.
Yeah.
I think the current situation is most charities believe that growth is success. We should
Correct.
get bigger.
Yeah.
And the bigger we are, the more successful we are.
Yep.
Now, I think that's really valid for particularly private companies. Of course, you want to create market share, market value. That totally makes
Social
sense.
responsibility. Yeah.
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 So, Amazon wants to get bigger. Apple wants to have a bigger market cap. Absolutely on board with that. I understand why. But I think for charities, actually making yourself redundant is success. So I thought putting the two words together, it would combine to indicate a new form of charity.
It's interesting you say that. I was recently at another panel event, and one of the things that we learned, which is kind of adjacent to what you're saying, is that, as an example, when we engage with indigenous communities, I think people who do the engagement need to be comfortable to give their control to the local communities, to sort of so them they know better on how to enable and structure and sort of develop and engage them, and which is pretty similar to what you were saying, I'm guessing, is because it is important to support charities, but when the time is right, pass that control on to local communities to empower them, but yet give them enough enablement to keep going.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth highlighting. Well, what's the opposite approach to that?
Yeah.
So the opposite and typical approach, I would argue, is the charities do the work on behalf of the other people.
Correct.
And they would say for the people, but I would also say, on behalf of. And what that does is it creates a power imbalance where
Yes.
you, as the person I'm helping, is always in the subjugated power dynamic and I'm always on top. But exactly as you said, Vikas, if you set up the person you're trying to help to be in charge and you give them the ownership and the power, then you're actually changing the power dynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they can continue the work for themselves.
In your experience and when you were researching this book, what have you picked up as, say, some of the key learnings that people who want to engage with charity can do better? And I mean this when I say people corporate,
Sure.
who want to, who make this strong decision of giving control and making it a redundant charity. What are the sort of two or three observations from your perspective?
I think the first thing is and it's the very first chapter, it talks about the private sector influence on charities.
Yeah.
So I already mentioned, for private companies, they have this desire to grow. And I believe a lot of that mindset trickles down. Into charities, but
Yeah.
it's not appropriate for a charity. So I would argue that one of the first things for someone in a corporate environment who's involved in charities to do is to actually unlearn
Okay.
a lot of the things that they know and to go in and ask questions and to be open-minded about the charity, because it's very different, of course, in terms of its objectives
Yes.
compared to a company. So I think that's one of the first things. And I guess the second thing would be to think hard about the effectiveness of the charity. So there is a lot of discussion and discourse around overheads
Yes.
in charities. It's a big topic, and I do think it's an important topic. But I would argue that a more important topic is actually how effective the charity is. The overheads discussion is about efficiency. Yes, it's important, but if the charity is not effective, either way, the efficiency is irrelevant, right?
Correct.
If it doesn't set out to achieve what it's supposed to achieve.
Correct.
So my view is that this model of charity, i.e. a charity that actually ends, that is one view and one way of assessing whether or not a charity is effective.
And any thoughts on, say, doing for a checkpoint at a later point once this control's been handed over, or any method or process that you perhaps would recommend to?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, because I was actually doing a talk yesterday at university, and one of the students said, this charity that I set up in Cambodia, which will end in 2030, they said, well, how do you know it's going to work? Will you go back in 2040? And my answer was basically like, oh, well, I guess we'll work it out when we get to that point.
True.
Because there's so much
Because you
to
can never
do.
foresee anything anyway. Yeah,
Yeah, there's so much to do. But I do think that there's value certainly in evaluating, what happens after, having some systems that do check. But I also wonder whether or not the systems can be created internally.
Yeah.
So in other words, this charity is setting up speech therapy as a profession in Cambodia because there are none. There are no speech therapists in the whole country. So we have to create the university course, we've got to create the awareness,
Yeah.
etc., government
Yeah.
involvement. So one of the internal checks would be a professional body,
Yep.
of speech therapists in Cambodia,
Yep.
so that they can internally regulate. And that means that we as the foreigners don't need to come in as experts. We give off that ownership to local people to regulate their own profession.
And I think which completely makes sense. But I'm just wondering how easy it will be for someone to have that level of emotional intelligence. I would imagine you need, but also a little bit of professional confidence to sort of say, I've set it up, and now it's yours, and now you go ahead and do what you need to do. And also, I'm just thinking logistically, say if you have to go back to a board and sort of give them an update, like this is what's happened, the first question the board would say is, well, that's fantastic, where do we go from here? And curious to know, I know, so we sort of touched upon it, that you just have to work it out as it goes. But to encourage more people to shift their thinking, are there any levers that you can perhaps talk to?
I think there's probably two things I'd mention. The first thing is that it has to happen anyway. At some point, a charity shut down.
Will happen eventually.
Yeah, they leave.
It's not sustainable model.
Exactly.
Longevity-wise.
You know, and charities leave countries all the time. And my point is that it's better to set that exit and shutting down up intentionally.
Okay.
You know, we might as well set the date in advance and work towards that, rather than saying, you know what, next year we're gone.
Okay.
You know, so that's the first thing. But I think the second thing is that, and this goes well beyond charities, this is kind of life is a process of letting go. You know, when you have kids,
that's true.
You can't helicopter them their whole lives. At some point, you need to set it up so they can make decisions for themselves. Same with a company, anything in life. So I think it's a lot of the same.
I think it's very simple but a profound thing what you've said, right? Like it's supposed to be obvious, but yet it isn't, and sometimes you have to spell it out. Now to talk about your book. Now, how easy is it to write a book? Because I'm guessing this is your first book, and how was it? I don't know if you want to talk about your writing process and how many, I'm assuming, arguments you may or may not have with your editor or publisher and stuff like that. And
yeah, I think the answer is it's relatively easy to write a book and go through the process if you are, you know, organized and you do the research, because of course, particularly when it's your first, you know, like no one gets up and knows how to write a book intuitively. So, you know, a lot of questions, a lot of reading, a lot of research. But I really enjoy the creative process, I've realized, because one of the things that happened was I got to interview these incredible charities from all around the world who are doing work in this way that I believe holds a lot of integrity and really goes against the system. The system encourages us to grow charities and to keep this cycle of dependency going, like I experienced in China, you know, and I think it's a lot harder to do it in this way. So meeting them gave me a lot of hope that, you know, not everything's broken. There's a lot of great things going on. And then in terms of wrapping up the book itself, so, you know, I actually self-published this, and I did a lot of that work myself with working with the editors and working with the different publishing companies and so on. So you get quite a lot of control there, and it's a lot of time and effort. And then you've got to sell the book, and then you've got to go around and talk about it. And I think that's the thing that a lot of authors forget. You know, it's a lot of effort to actually get the book into people's hands. But, you know, overall, it's worth it.
And is it fun doing it?
I really enjoy it, but, you know, I think it comes back to why are you doing it in the first place. So for me, the book is not helping me in my daily life in the sense of it's not connected to my day job. It's not going to help me get more consulting clients or whatever. But I do believe in the message. I think this is an important thing to talk about. And I do believe if more charities adopt this approach, people will be helped better. So that will be an impact that I'll have well beyond the book.
Yes. And the audience, right, for this book is pretty much anyone who's interested in this topic. Because you're not limiting in terms, it's a book that anyone can read it for information. Of course, it's targeted more specifically for charities and people who are interested in charities. But from a general standpoint, it's a read that everyone can take away.
So of course, you know, all authors and all creators love to get good reviews, but I think one of the best reviews that I got that sticks in my head is someone who doesn't work in the charity sector, who actually works in superannuation, funnily enough, and he wrote this review and he said, you know, there's some really great management principles here that could be applied to any workplace. And it's not specific to charities. So, you know, in that sense, I wanted the book to be accessible. It's written without jargon. It's written, you know, in a fairly conversational tone. It's not long. It's only about 140 pages long, so you could knock it off in a few hours if you were diligent about it and fast. So I think,
or if you're on a flight somewhere, absolutely.
If you're on a flight, or, you know, you're waiting for a train or a train is cancelled, like
Yep.
mine was last night. But there's all sorts of places you can pick it up, and then very soon there'll be an audiobook as well, which is
Oh,
great.
congratulations! That's fantastic. Okay. And what next for you? Like, what are some of the next? Are you writing more books? Are you? I don't know if you want to talk about the work that you do outside of of the book, and
Yeah,
so
sure.
that people can know.
Yeah, definitely. So my whole career in my life has been angling towards this idea. How do you help people best?
Yeah.
We have such limited time on the world. I really want to work on projects that are really effective and often groups of people that are being missed.
Yes.
So this example of speech therapy, it's not as sexy as malaria, HIV/AIDS, or some of the better known causes, but it is really needed.
Correct.
And when we talk about the group of people that need it versus those who can do it, there's literally zero, like no therapist who can do this in Cambodia.
Yeah.
But what I've done recently in the last 6 years is a social enterprise called UMBO.
Yep.
So it's online speech and occupational therapy. We are for profit, for purpose,
Yep.
and we predominantly work with regional communities.
Okay.
So people that are on long wait lists, very high proportion of Indigenous clients as well, and then also 50% of our profit, we use it to give people free services
Yep.
when they can't afford to pay. So that, unlike the charity, I believe it does better when it grows.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of growth that's been happening there,
Yep.
which is great. And so that's going well as well, but it's very involved.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now I have to ask you, what was the last book you read, which is not your own?
Yeah, I actually just finished a book fairly recently called Inferior.
Yeah.
So it's written by a British author, Angela Saini,
Okay.
and it talks about the intersection between science and women.
Yeah.
And it talks about how there's been a lot of efforts in science to prove, in inverted commas, that women are inferior to men. And actually, not surprisingly,
Yeah.
it's not very factual.
Of
In
course
fact,
not. Yeah, and in this podcast we don't agree with that at all. But it's an interesting,
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's-
but
it's
it's
a
an interesting
wonderful
topic to explore, and
yeah,
absolutely.
It's one of these things where I think intuitively the author is correct in terms of the argument, but I want to dig a little bit deeper as to why she believes that and the arguments put forward.
Yeah.
And it's excellent. It's really
Awesome.
good.
And now, where can people purchase this book if they wanted to?
Yeah, so you can get it on Amazon if that's your preferred method, but it's always good, I believe, to support authors directly.
Yeah.
So you can go to redundantcharities.com
Yep.
and then you can buy it through there, both physical and ebook versions available.
Yep.
And I can also sign a copy and send it.
Awesome. So I'll put the website on the link on our Spotify and our YouTube channel as well, so you can go directly and purchase from there and support Weh. And thank you, Weh. This was a fun conversation. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It's fantastic. I'm just going to pick it up so that people get a closer look. So the book is Redundant Charities. The author is Weh Yeoh, and you can get it on, as he said, at Amazon or directly from the website, and we'll link everything onto our episode pages. So please go and support. This is a fantastic book, and there's some really good information. So please go and read it. And,
Thanks, Vikas.
And Weh's actually signed one for me as well. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. So there you go. Well, congratulations on your book once again, and I wish you all the best. Now, before we wrap up, we ask all the guests 2 questions, which I don't think I've briefed you on, I imagine. So it'll
I
be
love
like a
spontaneity.
spontaneity.
I'm cool.
What's the one thing you love about Melbourne?
Oh, one. I mean, how can I possibly come up with one? I think that, yeah, I mean, food and culture, Melbourne's got it down pat, and I mean, I'm from Sydney.
Yep.
Hand on heart, I think Sydney's getting better, but I think Melbourne's definitely ahead.
It always was.
It always was, always will.
It always was, it always will be.
Appropriating that
Yeah.
that saying for the wrong meaning, but Melbourne really kills it with that kind
Out
of
of
stuff.
love, yes,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. And what's your anthem song?
Oh, it's hard to pick one song at the moment. I'm really digging this American singer called Gregory Alan Isakov,
Yeah.
who's a folk singer. He apparently lives on a farm,
Okay.
and he's a former horticulturist, and he actually played in Sydney and I believe Melbourne recently.
Yeah.
And very soulful, beautiful music.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate you coming in on the podcast and talking about your book. And I hope when you write your next book, we can have you back.
Love
so
to.
we'll look forward to that.
Love
All
to.
right. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.